Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad. So, I want you to imagine sitting in a clinical therapy room.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, exactly. It's the 1950s. You have a patient sitting across from you, and let's call her Eve.
Right, classic case.
Right. So she's demure, she's quiet, practically whispering as she talks about these severe headaches she's having.
Yeah.
She is basically the picture of conventional reserved politeness.
Very 1950s housewife.
Exactly. And then right in front of your eyes, she grabs her head, her hands drop to her sides, and her posture completely, totally transforms.
It's just a complete physical shift.
Yeah, a bright, reckless, almost predatory smile spreads across her face. And in a totally different, vibrant voice, she says, "Hi there, Doc."
Which is terrifying, honestly.
Totally terrifying. She then proceeds to introduce herself as an entirely different person with, different memories, different tastes, just a completely different personality.
Yeah, it sounds like the setup for a psychological thriller, honestly, but it is one of the most famous clinical realities in the history of our field.
I know, right?
And it perfectly encapsulates the impossible task that psychologists face every single day. Because how do you, as a scientist, actually prove what just happened?
Right. How do you measure the fracture of a human mind? Which is exactly what we are going to be unpacking today.
It's a big topic.
It is a massive topic. So
Yeah.
you grab a coffee, pull up a chair, and get comfortable. Because you are officially our third study buddy for this deep dive into the course material.
Welcome to the group.
Yeah, we are staring down the barrel of a massive research methods exam on abnormal behavior. We're covering Chapter 4 today, and let me tell you, it is a beast.
Oh, it's totally a beast, but it's also, without a doubt, the most important material we will ever study in this degree.
For sure, because studying abnormal psychology isn't just about memorizing a static list of disorders from a manual.
Right, or trying to secretly diagnose your friends while you're sitting at a coffee shop.
Would have all done it, but yeah.
Yeah.
It is fundamentally about epistemology. It's
Mhm.
about figuring out how we know what we claim to know.
Exactly. The mission for our shared study session today is to crack the code on how researchers define, measure, and ultimately attempt to treat human suffering.
All while trying to maintain absolute scientific rigor.
Which is so much easier said than done.
Oh, way easier said than done. So to get this incredibly dense material to actually stick in our heads for the exam, we cannot just read this textbook like it's a stereo instruction manual.
No, that is a guaranteed way to fall asleep.
Yeah, we're going to need mental shortcuts. We need, vivid analogies.
And honestly, we need to confront some of the incredibly deep moral, ethical, and even religious questions that this kind of research inevitably kicks up.
Yeah, because when you're dealing with trauma and abuse and mental illness, you aren't just crunching numbers in a spreadsheet.
No, you are touching on the absolute core of the human condition.
Well said. Okay, let's unpack this. I'm opening the textbook to Chapter 4 right now. Let's start at the absolute foundation.
Good call. Before we can dive into the sensational case studies like Eve, we have to establish the ground rules of the playing field.
Right. What actually separates science from just, having a really strong opinion?
Or from just making an educated guess.
Exactly. And the textbook starts right at the root, literally the etymology of the word. The word science comes from the Latin word "scire," which simply translates to know.
Right. But in the realm of psychology, science operates as two distinct things simultaneously.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, it is a method. It's a highly structured, systematic way of acquiring and evaluating new information.
Like the actual process of doing it.
Right. But second, it is also a goal. The ultimate destination is the development of grand, overarching theories that can explain that information and predict future behavior.
So it's the journey and the destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to ensure that this journey doesn't just wander off into the realm of fantasy or, pseudoscience, psychological science relies on two massive, non-negotiable pillars.
Okay, the pillars. Let's get these down for the exam.
Yeah, if a concept doesn't rest on these two pillars, it gets thrown out of the scientific arena entirely. The first pillar is testability.
Testability. Okay, let's unpack this because it's guaranteed to be a short answer question.
Oh, 100%.
So testability means that any proposition, any idea, or any claim has to be stated in a clear, precise way that leaves it open to systematic probing.
Right. And here's the kicker, the really important part. It must be subject to disproof.
Yes, the concept of falsifiability.
You cannot just make a vague, sweeping claim that can be twisted to fit any outcome.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, for example, if I tell you, Invisible, undetectable gremlins are causing my anxiety.
Okay, gremlins.
Right. That is not a scientifically valid statement. Why? Because there is absolutely no way you could ever design an experiment to prove me wrong.
Right. If you say they are undetectable, my failure to detect them just proves your point.
Exactly. It's a closed loop. It's unscientific.
Whereas a true scientific theory takes a risk. The textbook explicitly calls these risky tests.
I like that phrasing, risky tests.
Yeah, so if I hypothesize that childhood physical trauma causes maladjustment in adulthood, that sounds perfectly plausible.
Sure.
But to make it science, I have to frame it in a way that can be tested in the public arena. I have to define what trauma is, define what maladjustment is, and put my hypothesis out there knowing that the data might completely contradict me.
Which brings us to the second massive pillar, replicability.
Replicability, right.
Science is not a solitary endeavor. It is deeply public. If you, as a researcher, run a brilliant experiment in your lab and find a groundbreaking cure for depression, but no one else in the world can ever recreate those results.
Under the exact same prescribed circumstances.
Exactly. If they can't recreate it, the scientific community is going to reject your findings.
It's the ultimate peer pressure. You have to leave a recipe so precise that a scientist in Tokyo and a scientist in Toronto can follow your exact steps and bake the exact same cake.
That's a great way to put it. If it only happens once, it's an anomaly. If it happens repeatedly under prescribed circumstances, it's science.
Right. And these pillars are what allow us to build theories. But we have to be careful with that word, right?
Yeah, because in everyday conversation, people use theory to mean a guess. Like, oh, I have a theory about who stole my lunch.
Right. But in science, a theory is a set of propositions meant to explain a class of observations. And crucially, a good theory generates hypotheses.
Give me an example to anchor that for the exam.
Okay, take the classical conditioning theory of phobias.
Oh, right. Okay.
This is the overarching theory that we learn fears by associating a neutral object with a terrifying event. Now, the theory itself is broad,
Right.
but it generates a very specific, testable hypothesis. If classical conditioning causes phobias, then we should expect that people with a specific phobia, let's say, a paralyzing fear of dogs.
Okay, fear of dogs.
We should expect they have a significantly higher rate of past traumatic experiences with dogs compared to the general non-phobic population.
So the theory acts as a flashlight, telling the researcher exactly where to look.
Exactly. Okay, that makes perfect sense for things we can easily observe. A dog is observable. A dog bite is observable.
Right.
But here is where I get tripped up and where psychology separates itself from the hard sciences like physics or chemistry.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
In chemistry, you can physically weigh the elements. You can measure the temperature of the bubbling liquid.
Yeah.
But in psychology, we are forced to deal with what the textbook calls theoretical concepts.
This is the central paradox of our entire field, honestly. Theoretical concepts are unobservable states or processes.
We can't see them.
Right. We have to infer their existence from the data, but we can never actually see them.
Exactly. I can't put repression into a test tube. I can't draw a patient's blood and say, yes, you have exactly 400 milligrams of unprocessed grief.
Right. We are dealing with invisible architecture.
Invisible architecture. I like that.
It's a profound challenge. Imagine a child who experiences a terrifying event, like a severe car accident.
Oh.
For months afterward, their behavior drastically changes. They refuse to get into vehicles, they have nightmares, they become withdrawn.
Standard trauma response.
Right, but we have to bridge the temporal gap between the accident in the past and the behavior in the present.
Right.
To do that, we introduce the unobservable theoretical concept of an acquired fear or anxiety. We hypothesize that this invisible state is actively living inside the child, controlling their present actions.
Okay, to help us memorize the sheer utility of theoretical concepts for the exam, I actually came up with an analogy.
Oh, let's hear it.
I want you to picture a giant flowchart on a whiteboard. Let's say we are looking at 3 entirely different, highly stressful situations.
Okay, what are they?
Situation A, you are about to take a massive make-or-break final exam. Situation B, you are strapped to a chair, expecting to receive a mild electric shock.
Unpleasant.
Yeah. And situation C, you just found out your significant other is cheating on you, and you are about to confront them in a huge fight.
Okay, 3 vastly different environmental triggers.
Exactly. But now let's look at the observable physical and behavioral reactions for all 3 of those situations.
Right, your body reacts similarly.
Yes. You are going to have sweaty palms, a racing, pounding heartbeat. You're going to give a subjective self-report of feeling tense. You might have visible hand tremors.
True.
Now, imagine we lived in a scientific world where we didn't use theoretical concepts. To map this out, you would have to draw a separate, individual arrow from every single situation directly to every single physical reaction.
That sounds incredibly messy.
It would be a chaotic, tangled plate of spaghetti.
Yeah.
An arrow from the exam to the sweat. An arrow from the exam to the heartbeat. An arrow from the shock to the sweat.
It would be computationally exhausting and honestly scientifically useless.
Exactly. But instead, theoretical concepts save the day. We take all three of those situations, the exam, the shock, the fight, and we funnel them all into one single central hub in the middle of the whiteboard.
And we label that invisible hub anxiety.
Yes, the situations cause the anxiety. And then the anxiety hub draws arrows out to the sweaty palms, the racing heart, and the tremors. It takes chaos and turns it into an elegant, organized system for understanding human behavior.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. It simplifies the massive complexity of the human experience.
Right.
But if I can play devil's advocate here and push back a little, which is exactly what the field of psychology did historically.
Please do.
This beautiful flowchart opens up a massive, glaring vulnerability. If this hub of anxiety is completely invisible, how on earth do we prove it actually exists?
Yes, exactly. If we can't see it, aren't we just violating that first pillar of testability?
Well, historically, there was a very strict militant school of scientific thought that tried to solve this exact problem. It was called operationism.
Operationism, okay.
And operationists took a very hardline stance. They argued that a theoretical concept is defined by one thing and one thing only: a single observable, measurable operation.
Give me an example of what that looks like in practice.
Under strict operationism, the theoretical concept of anxiety literally just means scoring above a 50 on the Taylor Manifest Anxiety Scale questionnaire, period. Full stop.
Wait, really? Just the questionnaire?
Just the questionnaire. The concept is entirely synonymous with that single measurement. If you didn't take the questionnaire, you cannot, by scientific definition, have anxiety.
That seems incredibly reductive. It feels like you are stripping away the entire human experience just to make the math easier.
It was incredibly reductive. It completely robbed theoretical concepts of their explanatory power and their generality. Think about the concept of learning.
Okay.
If a strict operationist defines learning solely as a laboratory rat pressing a metal bar for a food pellet.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. What happens when a human child successfully completes their math homework? Under that strict definition, the child isn't learning because they aren't a rat pressing a bar.
Right. The definition becomes a prison.
Thankfully, the scientific community realized this was a dead end. The field evolved to a much more flexible, yet still rigorous, modern approach.
Which is?
Today, instead of operationism, we rely on a set of operations.
A set of operations. Let's break that down.
Yeah. It means we never rely on just one tether to anchor our invisible concept to reality. We use multiple, diverse measurements.
Okay, so building on the anxiety example.
Today, anxiety isn't just a questionnaire score. It is the questionnaire score, the subjective self-report, plus the measurement of galvanic skin response and heart rate, the physiological operation,
Right.
plus the clinical observation of hand tremors and avoidance behavior, the behavioral operation. You use a constellation of observable metrics to confidently triangulate the invisible concept in the center.
You know, as we are studying this, I can't help but draw a connection to something way outside of our textbook.
Oh, what's that?
Well, thinking about these invisible hubs and sets of operations sharply contrasts with how human beings historically deal with the unobservable, specifically like in moral, spiritual, or religious frameworks.
That's an interesting pivot. How do you mean?
Well, think about religion or spirituality. In those domains, human beings also deal constantly with unobservable theoretical concepts. We talk about a soul, or divine grace, or karma, or sin. But in a religious framework, faith is fundamentally placed in the unobservable, explicitly, without the requirement of empirical proof.
Yeah, that is the very definition of faith.
Exactly. You don't need a replicable set of operations to prove that divine grace exists. Believing in it without seeing it is actually considered a virtue.
Right, the lack of empirical measurement is a feature, not a bug, in theology.
Exactly. But in scientific psychology, we are playing a completely different game. We're also obsessed with the invisible. You know, the mind, the ego, trauma, repression, anxiety.
But we are absolutely forbidden from using faith.
Yes. The scientific method dictates that we can only trust our invisible concepts if we have a strict, mercilessly tested set of physical operations to tether them to reality.
If we don't have the operations, we don't have science.
It's like we are trying to map out the spiritual immaterial realm of the human mind, but we are only allowed to use a ruler and a stopwatch. It's a fascinating, almost paradoxical endeavor.
What's fascinating about that endeavor is the sheer human creativity it requires. What's fascinating here is building a theory to map the invisible isn't just a matter of crunching numbers on a spreadsheet like some unfeeling algorithm.
There's an art to it.
There is a deep, profound art to it. The textbook specifically notes that theories don't just mechanically emerge from the data. Often, they seem to leap from a scientist's head in a wonderful, unexpected moment of insight.
The classic eureka moment.
Exactly. It's that moment where a researcher is staring at a mountain of seemingly disconnected data, and suddenly, a previously overlooked connection snaps into place. The invisible hub reveals itself.
It is a deeply creative, almost philosophical act.
It's just an act that is subsequently bound by the ruthless, uncompromising rules of testability and replicability.
Right. Okay, so we have established the grand, overarching philosophy of psychological science. We know the rules of the game.
We do?
But grand theories of anxiety or depression don't just fall out of the sky. To generate them, scientists often have to start at the absolute micro level.
They have to look at individual human beings.
Which transitions us perfectly into our first major research method, the case study.
If we are leaning on our mental shortcuts for the exam, let's conceptualize the case study as the magnifying glass of psychology.
I like that. The magnifying glass.
A case study involves collecting incredibly detailed historical, biographical, and clinical information on a single individual.
Right.
When you hold a magnifying glass up to a subject, you see every tiny, intimate detail. You see the texture of their childhood, their complex family dynamics, their obscure medical history.
And the minute-by-minute transcripts of their therapy sessions.
Exactly. It provides a richness of data that a massive population survey could never hope to achieve.
But just like a physical magnifying glass, while it gives you incredible focus on one specific spot, it completely robs you of your peripheral vision.
Yeah, that's the trade-off.
You can't see the broader population. You can't tell if what you are looking at is common or an absolute 1 in a billion anomaly.
Exactly. But man, the things that researchers have seen under that magnifying glass over the last century, case studies are where psychology confronts the truly bizarre, the terrifying, and the extremes of the human mind.
Which brings us back to the hook you started us off with. We have to talk about the 3 faces of Eve.
We absolutely do. This is a classic foundational text for abnormal psychology. It's the 1954 case study published by psychiatrists Thigpen and Cleckley.
And it reads like a novel.
Walk us through the clinical presentation again.
So a 25-year-old married woman comes into psychotherapy. She is complaining of severe, blinding headaches and terrifying blackouts where she loses hours or days of time.
The psychiatrist referred to her in the case study as Eve White.
Right, and Thigpen describes Eve White in his notes as incredibly demure, retiring, and rigidly polite. She is a conventional, somewhat repressed 1950s housewife who is clearly suffering deeply.
She is the baseline personality.
Right. Yeah, so Thigpen is interviewing her, trying to get to the root of these blackouts. And then one day, right in the middle of a standard session, something impossible happens.
The shift.
The shift. Eve White suddenly grabs her head in obvious agonizing pain. She drops her hands. And in an instant, her entire physiological presentation shifts. A quick, reckless, deeply confident smile spreads across her face.
Her eyes widen.
Yeah, and in a bright, sparkling, totally uninhibited voice, she looks at the psychiatrist and says, "Hi there, doc."
The shift isn't just behavioral, it's practically a change in identity.
It is a change in identity. The demure, suffering Eve White completely melts away. This new woman sitting in the chair speaks casually about Eve White in the third person.
Usually with a tone of contempt.
Yes. When Dr. Thigpen, utterly bewildered, asks her who she is, she replies, "Oh, I'm Eve Black."
And Eve Black is everything Eve White is not.
She is exuberant, she is reckless, she is flirtatious. She admits to taking control of the body, going out to bars, and buying incredibly expensive clothes that the impoverished Eve White cannot afford.
Which explains the mysterious blackouts and the missing money.
Exactly. And most crucially, Eve Black has all these distinct memories that Eve White has absolutely no access to.
It is a stunning clinical observation. And it only gets more complicated.
Way more complicated.
Yeah.
Over the course of 14 months and roughly 100 hours of grueling clinical interviews, a third personality organically emerges in the therapy room.
Jane.
Yes, her name is Jane. Jane is totally different from both Eves. She is mature, highly capable, vivid, and emotionally balanced.
And Jane actually possesses awareness of both Eve White and Eve Black, right?
She does. But neither of the Eves knows Jane exists. It is a locked-room mystery inside a single human brain.
And this case study became an absolute cultural phenomenon. It was turned into a best-selling book and an Academy Award-winning movie.
Scientifically, it was one of the first highly detailed, widely published accounts of what the DSM now categorizes as dissociative identity disorder, or DDD.
From a research methods standpoint, Thigpen and Cleckley's case study provided the field with an unprecedented level of detail regarding interview procedures, the manifestation of dissociative symptoms, and the extreme lengths the human mind will go to protect itself.
It did. It's a legendary case.
Yeah.
But, and this is a massive exam failing, but if we don't address it, we have to put our critical thinking caps on here.
Okay, let's critique it.
Because the case study method has gaping, massive vulnerabilities when it comes to scientific validity.
You're talking about the subjective lens of the clinician.
Exactly. I want to push back on the idea that case studies are objective science. A case study is essentially a story.
Right.
And a story is heavily, unavoidably influenced by the storyteller's paradigm. If a strict Freudian psychoanalyst treats a patient, their case study is going to highlight repressed psychosexual conflicts in dreams.
Sure.
If a modern behavioral therapist treats that exact same patient, their case study won't mention dreams at all. It will focus entirely on environmental reinforcements and conditioning.
The magnifying glass only shows you what the scientist chooses to look at.
And the three faces of Eve is the ultimate cautionary tale for exactly that bias. Thigpen and Cleckley wrote their narrative, concluded their treatment, and essentially declared the case closed with a neat Hollywood-style integration of the personalities.
But decades later, the real woman behind the pseudonym, Chris Costner Sizemore, came forward and wrote her own memoirs.
And her reality completely shattered the psychiatrist's neat little narrative.
Oh, totally. Chris Sizemore revealed that she didn't just have 3 personalities. Over the course of her lifetime, she experienced 21 distinct, fully formed personalities, occurring in clusters of 3.
21. That completely changes the diagnostic landscape.
Furthermore, she revealed why her mind fractured, which the original case study heavily glossed over.
It wasn't just mysterious headaches.
No, it was a profound, desperate coping mechanism for severe childhood trauma. As a very young child, she had witnessed horrifying, gruesome events, including seeing a man sliced in half by machinery at a lumber mill and witnessing a drowned man pulled from a ditch.
Her mind literally shattered to compartmentalize the unbearable terror.
And Sizemore eventually went on to successfully integrate all of her personalities with a different therapist later in life, realizing they were all fractured aspects of her own resilience.
Wow.
She lived symptom-free for decades, but her revelation proved that Thigpen and Cleckley's famous case study was just a snapshot.
Just a fragment.
Yes, a fragment of the truth, filtered entirely through the assumptions of 2 1950 psychiatrists who frankly missed the bigger picture.
Which perfectly highlights the rule for our exam. Case studies are absolutely brilliant for generating hypotheses, but they are practically useless for proving them.
You simply cannot rule out alternative explanations.
Exactly. If a therapist tries a brand new experimental technique on a depressed patient and the patient recovers in 10 months, what caused the recovery?
Was it the brilliant new therapy?
Or did the patient's abusive boss just happen to get fired in week 4, resolving their environmental stress? The case study, by its very nature, cannot isolate the variable. It can't tell you.
But we cannot discard the method because sometimes a case study is the absolute only scientific option available to us.
True.
Sometimes a clinical phenomenon is so incredibly rare or, frankly, so morally disturbing that you cannot exactly run a massive randomized laboratory experiment on 1,000 undergraduates to study it.
Right. You have to wait for it to happen in the wild, and when it does, you have to document it meticulously.
Which brings us to a specific Canadian case study from the textbook. That is, look, it is a very difficult, highly disturbing read.
Oh boy, the zoophilia case.
Yes. For the sake of the study session, we need to remain clinical here, but it is an extreme manifestation of abnormal behavior.
Right. To lay out the facts, Earls and Lalibert conducted an in-depth case study on a 54-year-old man who was currently serving a prison sentence for extreme animal cruelty.
Right.
Specifically, he was engaging in long-term sexual activity with horses. He had grown up on an isolated farm, and during the clinical interviews, he detailed that his involvement wasn't merely a physical compulsion.
He claimed there was a profound emotional and romantic component to his bond with the animals.
It challenges the very boundaries of conventional psychopathology.
It does, and the case culminated in a truly horrific incident that led to his incarceration. He brutally killed a mare.
And the clinical justification he provided to the researchers for this act was what made the case study so uniquely terrifying.
He didn't kill the mare out of sadism or anger at the animal.
No, he claimed he killed the mare out of jealousy because the mare had shown mating interest in a stallion, and he felt betrayed.
It is a profound projection of complex human cognitive distortions, betrayal, romantic jealousy, infidelity, onto an animal.
And as an undergrad reading this chapter, it just hits you with this overwhelming wave of moral shock. It evokes a visceral, undeniable disgust.
It is appalling on every level.
But it perfectly highlights the tension of being a psychological researcher. As human beings, our moral compass is screaming at us.
Right.
But as scientists, Earls and the Lumiere had an obligation to compartmentalize that disgust.
Wow.
They had to suppress their moral revulsion to remain entirely objective.
They had to sit in that room, listen to this man, and meticulously document the cognitive architecture of his jealousy to understand the underlying pathology.
And that painful objectivity is exactly what advanced the science, because a massive shift happened after they published this single disturbing case study.
Right, the feedback loop.
Exactly. When the media inevitably reported on this initial case study, the researchers didn't just receive outrage, they received a flood of responses from the public.
People began contacting them with information about other cases, leading to a subsequent highly detailed case study in 2009 about another man they named Possum.
Wow.
But more importantly, the publication of the case study forced Earls and Lumiere to fundamentally revise their broader theoretical conclusion.
How so?
Initially, based on the literature, they hypothesized that extreme zoophilia of this nature was a vanishingly rare, almost non-existent anomaly.
But the public response to the case study proved them wrong.
The feedback loop taught them that this pathology was far more prevalent than the psychiatric community believed.
The magnifying glass, applied objectively to a single horrific case, successfully revealed a hidden, highly disturbed subculture that science had completely overlooked.
So even with all their flaws, case studies still hold a vital place in the field.
In fact, the textbook mentions they are currently experiencing a massive resurgence in psychotherapy training.
Because we now have the technology to objectively record video and audio of therapy sessions.
Right. Novice clinicians don't just have to read abstract, dry statistics. They can watch a case study unfold minute by minute, analyzing the micro-expressions of the patient and the specific real-time application of therapeutic techniques.
It bridges the gap between raw data and human interaction, which serves as a perfect conceptual bridge into the broader domain of qualitative research.
Qualitative research. Let's define this clearly. If quantitative research, the hard statistics, the p-values, the effect sizes, is all about asking how many or how much, qualitative research is fundamentally about asking, what is it like?
It focuses on the rich, deeply subjective lived experiences of human beings rather than trying to average them out into numbers.
And the textbook highlights 3 exceptional Canadian examples to demonstrate how qualitative research illuminates what statistics miss.
The first is a 2006 study by LaFrance and Stoppard. They adopted a specific feminist perspective to analyze the accounts of 15 women who are actively recovering from clinical depression.
Now, a quantitative study would just give these 15 women a depression inventory every week and graph the symptom reduction. But LaFrance and Stoppard didn't do that.
No, they conducted deep, open-ended interviews. They wanted to hear the women's actual narratives of recovery.
And what did they find?
It was fascinating. They discovered that for these women, healing wasn't just about serotonin levels. It involved a profound identity transformation. The women described the necessity of actively killing off their former distressed selves.
Specifically, they identified 3 toxic identities that society had forced upon them.
Right.
First, the good woman, who is pathologically obedient and accommodating to everyone else's needs.
Yeah.
Second, the control freak, who is driven to exhaustion by impossible standards of perfectionism.
And third,
The victim, who feels entirely selfless and powerless. The qualitative data showed that clinical recovery explicitly required these women to rebel against these societal expectations and forge entirely new, authentic identities.
See, a standardized questionnaire would never capture the nuance of killing off the good woman.
Never.
The second example is Christine Kurtzlandi's 2009 study. She focused on socioeconomically disadvantaged postpartum women. Again, there were no heart rate monitors or Likert scales here, just in-depth, empathetic interviews.
And her qualitative research illuminated the crushing, multidimensional reality of being a new mother living in extreme poverty.
Right. These women described a profound lack of emotional support and a terrifying sense of feeling out of control.
But crucially, the interviews revealed that their deepest suffering came from dealing with compounding dual stigmas.
The societal judgment.
Yes. They were carrying the intense societal stigma of being on government welfare, compounded by the stigma of medical professionals and social workers, silently judging them as bad mothers or stupid simply because they were poor.
That dual stigma is a massive driver of postpartum pathology.
And again, you cannot capture the suffocating weight of societal judgment by asking someone to circle a number from 1 to 5.
Exactly. Qualitative research gives voice to the voiceless.
What's the third example?
The third example from the text is a 2012 study by Marcus and colleagues. They looked at a relatively new phenomenon, young adults who blog extensively about their mental health struggles online.
And they utilized a specific qualitative methodology called grounded theory.
Grounded theory. Let's make sure we underline this for the exam. This is a crucial concept.
Okay, let me explain it. In traditional science, you start from the top down. You invent a theory, generate a hypothesis, and then gather data to see if you are right.
Right, that's what we usually learn.
But grounded theory is completely bottom-up. You don't start with any hypothesis at all. You approach the data completely fresh.
So in this case?
In this case, the researchers just read hundreds of mental health blogs over and over, meticulously coding the language until the overarching themes organically emerged from the ground up.
And what were the massive themes that emerged from these young bloggers?
2 devastating core beliefs. I am entirely powerless, and I am utterly alone.
Qualitative research humanizes the data. It reminds us that behind every diagnostic criteria is a subjective experience of suffering, which is absolutely vital if we actually want to connect with and help people.
Okay, take a deep breath.
Yeah.
We have spent a long time looking through the intimate, highly focused magnifying glass of case studies and qualitative interviews.
We have.
But now, it is time to pivot. We are trading the magnifying glass for a wide-angle lens, a satellite view from space. We are moving into the realm of epidemiology.
Right. If the case study is deeply concerned with asking, what is the specific nature of this one individual's pain, epidemiology zooms out.
How far out?
It asks, how does this pain distribute itself across the geography of an entire nation? It is the rigorous study of the frequency and distribution of a disorder within a specific population.
Okay, to memorize the 3 primary goals of epidemiology for the exam, I'm using a simple acronym. PIR, pronounced like peer, or the start of the word pirate, PIR.
Let's break down the acronym.
The P stands for prevalence. Prevalence is simply the proportion of a population that currently has a specific disorder at a given time or over their lifetime.
Give me an example.
For example, if we ask what percentage of adult Canadians will experience a major depressive episode at some point in their entire lives, the answer to that is the lifetime prevalence rate. It tells us the sheer scale of the problem.
Next is the I, which stands for incidence. Incidence is slightly different, and students often confuse the two. Incidence is the number of brand new cases of a disorder that emerge within a specific time period, typically 1 year.
Let me make sure I understand the difference, because that sounds like a trick question on a multiple choice test.
Yeah.
Why do we care about incidence if we already know the prevalence?
Great question. Let's say a government launches a massive multi-million-dollar public health campaign to prevent youth anxiety. 5 years later, you want to know if it worked.
Right.
If you look at prevalence, the total number of people who have anxiety, the number might still be huge because it includes people who've been suffering for 20 years.
Oh, I see.
But if you look at incidence, the rate of teenagers newly developing anxiety this year, and that number has plummeted, you know your prevention program is actually working. Incidence tracks the speed at which a disorder is spreading right now.
That perfectly clarifies it. Okay, and the final letter in PIR is R, which stands for risk factors. These are the specific conditions, variables, or demographic markers that, if present in a person's life, significantly increase their statistical likelihood of developing the disorder.
It's about identifying vulnerabilities before the disorder takes root.
And this is where the textbook uses massive Canadian epidemiological data sets to explore one of the darkest, most pervasive, and most destructive risk factors in the entirety of psychopathology.
Childhood abuse.
The data we are about to review is heavy. It is incredibly sobering. But as future researchers and clinicians, it is absolutely essential that we confront it.
The textbook draws heavily from two massive studies, the 1990 Ontario Mental Health Supplement and the much larger 2012 Canadian Community Health Survey, which meticulously interviewed over 23,000 people.
And the numbers that emerged from those surveys are staggering. They provide undeniable proof that parental mental disorder and severe childhood abuse are the strongest foundational risk factors for developing debilitating mental disorders later in adult life.
Let's look at the specific stats from the Ontario study.
Okay.
They looked at a subgroup of individuals who were suffering immensely, people who had been diagnosed with 2 or more comorbid mental disorders simultaneously.
The very severe cases.
Exactly. Out of that severely suffering group, an astonishing 38% reported experiencing severe sexual or physical abuse during their childhood.
90%.
And even more shockingly, 61% of them reported having parents who also suffered from a diagnosed mental disorder.
Wow. What this epidemiological data illustrates so violently is the compounding nature of systemic risk. Vulnerability is rarely isolated to just one single factor. It clusters.
Researchers at the University of Toronto analyzed this clustering effect.
Right, and what do they find?
They found that if you look at parental divorce, parental unemployment, and parental addiction as isolated variables, each one of them separately elevates the statistical risk that a child will experience physical abuse.
But when you combine them.
Exactly. When all three of those systemic factors are simultaneously present in a home environment, the rates of severe child physical abuse jump to a horrifying 41%.
To put that in perspective, that is a 15 times increase in risk compared to a stable home. The math of human suffering is exponential.
It's a cluster of profound vulnerability. And the textbook doesn't just leave this as abstract math. It grounds the statistical reality by referencing a highly specific, unimaginably horrific case from 2001 in Blackstock, Ontario.
Yes, the Blackstock case.
To give the listener context, police responded to a rural home and discovered 2 teenage boys aged 14 and 15. The investigation revealed that their parents had kept these boys locked inside separate, fully covered cribs for 10 years.
A decade.
For a decade, they were forced to wear diapers, they were subjected to severe physical punishment, and they were systematically starved. The responding police officers stated publicly that it was the absolute worst case of child abuse they had witnessed in their entire careers.
It completely defies our capacity for belief. It sounds like something out of a horror film, not reality.
But it happens. And the cold, hard numbers of epidemiology force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that it happens far, far more often than polite society wants to admit. In fact, nearly 1/3 of all Canadians report a history of experiencing at least some form of childhood abuse.
This brings up a really profound moral and societal dilemma for me, and I want to get your perspective on it.
Okay, let's hear it.
In Canada, we operate under strict duty to report legislation. This means that if you are a teacher, a doctor, a therapist, or just a neighbor, and you have any reasonable suspicion that a child is in danger or being abused, you are legally and morally obligated to report it to Child Protective Services immediately.
Correct. The foundational premise of the law is that society as a whole has an overarching moral duty to protect the innocent.
Right. But when you look at this epidemiological data, what you actually see is a massive, ongoing, systemic moral failure of that exact duty.
Especially when you analyze the specific data regarding First Nations communities in Canada.
Exactly. Let's look at those numbers. The epidemiological rates of investigated maltreatment for First Nations children living on reserve are drastically, disproportionately higher than the rates for non-Aboriginal Canadian children.
They are massively overrepresented in the child welfare system.
But, and this is the absolute most crucial part that the data reveals when you dig deeper, when researchers actually analyze the underlying factors driving these apprehensions, they found that Aboriginal ethnicity itself was absolutely not the predictive variable for kids being placed in out-of-home care.
The driving force wasn't ethnicity, and it wasn't a higher rate of malicious physical abuse.
No. The primary reason these children come to the attention of child welfare is parental physical neglect.
And when you trace the roots of that neglect,
it is almost entirely driven by extreme, grinding poverty, a total lack of adequate housing, a lack of community resources, and the generational trauma of addiction.
which completely shifts the moral framing of the entire issue. When we hear about child abuse, our moral outrage instinctively focuses on the individual bad actor, the evil parent locking a child in a room. But the epidemiological data forces us to realize that the grand moral failure is actually on a macro societal level. As a nation, we have structurally under-resourced these indigenous communities to the point where the environment itself is artificially generating the exact risk factors that destroy families.
Epidemiology takes our localized moral outrage
Yeah.
and points it directly at the systemic governmental level.
It demands that our moral duty isn't just to report abuse when it happens, but to enact massive public health interventions, build housing, and fund addiction services to prevent the risk factors from clustering in the first place.
It is a powerful tool. It tells us exactly where to aim our help and our resources. But here is where we must transition our thinking. Epidemiology has a massive, undeniable scientific limitation.
Let me guess. It relies almost entirely on correlational data.
Ah, yes. Welcome to the tricky, treacherous web of correlation.
So let's unpack this concept, because it is the most misunderstood concept in all of pop science.
Oh, without a doubt.
We know from epidemiology that extreme poverty and schizophrenia are strongly linked. We know that childhood abuse and adult depression are strongly linked, but correlation simply means that two variables covary. They fluctuate together in nature.
We measure them exactly as they exist in the real world without interfering. And mathematically, a correlation is expressed as a coefficient ranging from a perfect negative correlation of negative 1.00 to a perfect positive correlation of positive 1.00.
But the golden rule of psychology, the phrase tattooed on every undergrad's forehead, correlation does not imply causation.
Right. Just because poverty and schizophrenia gets together does not prove that one caused the other.
My absolute favorite analogy for understanding correlation versus causation, and you should definitely use this on the exam, is the watching a game versus playing the game analogy.
I love this one. Walk us through it.
Doing correlational research is the equivalent of sitting high up in the bleachers of a stadium with a notepad, watching a football game unfold below you. You are purely an observer.
Okay, I'm with you.
Over the course of the game, you document a very strong, highly positive correlation. Every single time the quarterback makes a throwing motion with his arm, the wide receiver runs down the field. The two variables are inextricably linked.
But because you were trapped in the bleachers just watching, you cannot technically, scientifically prove that the quarterback's arm motion caused the receiver to run.
Exactly. Maybe a coach on the sideline blew a silent dog whistle that caused both of them to move simultaneously. You don't know.
And to figure it out, you have to transition to the experimental method.
Exactly. The experiment is running down out of the bleachers, strapping on a helmet, getting onto the field, and physically tackling the wide receiver to the ground yourself. You actively manipulate the variables to see what happens to the rest of the system.
But before we get to the experiment, we have to understand the traps of correlation. Because the human brain is an aggressive pattern recognition machine.
It really is.
We are biologically wired to see two things happen together and instantly jump to the conclusion that one caused the other. It's a survival mechanism, but it's terrible for science.
Trap number 1, the directionality problem. Let's go back to the highly documented correlation between schizophrenia and social class.
Okay.
Epidemiological data overwhelmingly shows that lower-class individuals are far more frequently diagnosed with schizophrenia than upper-class individuals.
So if I am a lazy researcher, I jump straight to causation. I look at the data and say, obviously, the extreme grinding stress of living in poverty, the lack of nutrition, the daily trauma, that stress is what physically causes the onset of schizophrenia.
And that is a very famous, entirely plausible theory known as the sociogenic hypothesis. The arrow of causality points from poverty to illness.
But wait, what if the arrow is pointing the exact opposite direction?
Explain.
What if a young person from a wealthy family begins to develop the early disorganized behavior and cognitive decline associated with schizophrenia? Because of their illness, they fail out of university, they can't hold down a minimum wage job, they burn bridges with their family.
And then?
Over the course of 10 years, their untreated illness causes them to drift downward in social mobility until they end up in systemic poverty.
That is known as the downward drift hypothesis. The illness caused the poverty.
And the terrifying thing for researchers is that both the sociogenic hypothesis and the downward drift hypothesis are completely 100% supported by the exact same set of correlational data.
Looking at the data alone, it is literally impossible to know which way the arrow of directionality points.
Which brings us to an even sneakier, more dangerous pitfall. Trap number 2, the third variable problem.
Oh, this one is classic.
This is when two completely distinct variables are highly correlated with each other, but neither one is causing the other. Instead, they're both being secretly manipulated by an invisible, unmeasured third factor.
The textbook provides the ultimate classic example of the third variable problem. It's famous. Historically, researchers have noted a remarkably strong, statistically significant positive correlation between the number of churches in a given city and the number of violent crimes committed in that exact same city.
Okay, this is where the religious and moral biases come crashing into the science.
Yeah.
Because how you interpret that correlation depends entirely on the worldview you bring to the data.
Right.
If I am a militant, cynical atheist looking at that graph, I might triumphantly point at it and say, aha, look at the data. Religion fosters hypocrisy and violence. The proliferation of churches is actively causing a crime wave.
And conversely, if a deeply devout religious individual looks at the exact same graph, they will reach the exact opposite conclusion.
Right. What would they say?
They might say, no, you have it backward. A surging crime rate creates a terrifying, immoral society which causes desperate citizens to band together and build more churches to seek divine redemption.
Both sides are projecting their intense moral biases onto the math, when in reality, both of those causal assumptions are completely, laughably wrong.
Because they're completely blind to the third variable.
Exactly. The invisible third variable is simply population size. It's demographics. Think about it. A massive metropolis like Toronto has millions of people living in it.
Right.
Because it has millions of people, it naturally has a huge number of churches to serve them. And purely because it has millions of people, it mathematically has a higher sheer number of crimes.
Whereas a tiny rural farming village of 50 people has exactly one church and 0 murders.
Right. The churches and the crimes have absolutely nothing to do with each other. They aren't causing each other. They're both just independent reflections of how many human beings are packed into a geographic space.
It is such a brilliant, humbling reminder that we must ruthlessly check our personal, political, and moral biases at the door before we interpret statistics.
So the obvious question for the exam is, if correlational research is a minefield of directionality problems and invisible third variables, and we can't always run a laboratory experiment, how do researchers ever overcome these traps to find the truth?
The answer is time. They use time as their weapon. They utilize prospective, longitudinal research designs.
Longitudinal research, okay.
Logic is simple. A cause must temporally precede an effect. The quarterback has to throw the ball before the receiver catches it.
But designing a longitudinal study for mental illness is incredibly difficult. You can't just select 10,000 random healthy toddlers and track them for 50 years, waiting to see who happens to develop schizophrenia.
Right. It is astronomically expensive. Most people will drop out of the study. And since the prevalence rate of schizophrenia is roughly 1 in 100, you wouldn't get enough data to justify the cost.
Which is exactly why researchers developed the high-risk method.
The high-risk method, let's unpack that.
Instead of tracking the general population, you purposefully select a small cohort of individuals who already possess a known, significantly higher than average vulnerability.
Give me an example.
For example, you find 100 children who have a biological mother with diagnosed severe schizophrenia, which drastically raises their genetic risk profile. Then, you focus all your funding on tracking just them longitudinally over decades.
That's incredibly efficient. The textbook also highlights the famous Oregon Youth Study as a masterclass in longitudinal trajectory modeling.
Oh, right, the Oregon Youth Study.
Researchers followed a specific cohort of young men from age 15 all the way to age 24. Instead of just taking a single snapshot, they conducted exhaustive yearly assessments of their depression levels.
And because they tracked them over a decade, they were able to identify distinct subgroups, or what the researchers called latent trajectories.
What did they find?
They found one specific group of young men who exhibited a persistently high, unyielding level of depression across the entire decade. If the researchers had only done a cross-sectional study, just measuring them once at age 18, they would have missed the chronic nature of the pain.
And furthermore, the longitudinal design allowed them to see the directionality. They could clearly map that massive parental transitions, like a bitter divorce, temporally preceded the sharp spikes in the young men's depression. The cause came before the effect.
This specific approach actually highlights a massive, overarching philosophical division in how we conduct psychological research. It is the tension between nomothetic research and idiographic research.
Okay, let's define those because they are definitely vocabulary words we need to master.
Nomothetic comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. Nomothetic research is broad and variable-centered.
So it looks at a massive faceless group of people to try and establish grand general laws of human nature.
Exactly. For example, across a population of 10,000 people, anxiety and depression are generally correlated. It is the ultimate wide lens.
Idiographic, on the other hand, comes from the Greek word idios, meaning private, personal, or unique. It focuses intensely on the individual, exactly like the clinical case studies we talked about earlier.
Longitudinal trajectory modeling is actually an elegant attempt to bridge the gap between the two.
How so?
It analyzes a large population nomothetic, but uses complex math to find distinct, unique clusters of specific experiences idiographic hidden within the larger group.
Okay, we've watched the game from the bleachers, we've tracked the players over multiple seasons. Now it is finally time to strap on our helmets, run onto the field, and tackle the variables ourselves.
We are moving into the absolute gold standard of scientific proof, the experimental method.
The experiment. This is the promised land.
This is the only methodology in all of science that can definitively establish true, undeniable cause and effect. And the core difference is manipulation. You don't just passively measure variables, you actively control them.
We need to define the moving parts. In an experiment, the variable that the researcher actively manipulates and controls is called the independent variable.
The cause.
Yes. And the variable that the researcher subsequently measures to see what effect the manipulation had is called the dependent variable. It depends on the independent variable.
Well, let's ground this with the Martin Zak study. He is a researcher at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada, and this is a classic, relatable undergrad experiment.
Relatable, you say.
Very. Zak wanted to establish a causal link between mood and alcohol consumption. Does feeling bad literally cause you to drink more?
So he couldn't just survey people at a bar. He had to manipulate their mood in a lab.
Exactly. He brought a group of university undergrads into a controlled laboratory setting. He then randomly exposed them to a computer task that primed them with either deeply negative words, intensely positive words, or completely neutral words.
The specific type of word shown on the screen is the independent variable. Zak is in total control of it.
Then comes the measurement. After the word task, the students participate in a supposed taste test where they are given access to beer.
Right. The researcher meticulously measures exactly how many milliliters of beer each student consumes. The amount of beer consumed is the dependent variable.
And the results were clear.
The group primed with the negative words drank significantly more beer than the positive or neutral groups. By controlling the environment, Zak proved cause and effect. Negative priming causes increased consumption.
That's a great, straightforward example. Let's look at a much more profound, clinically relevant example from the textbook. The famous Pennebaker study on trauma, emotional expression, and physical health.
I found this study absolutely mind-blowing.
This study essentially launched an entire subfield of psychology. Pennebaker took a cohort of 50 undergraduate students and randomly assigned them into two distinct groups.
Okay, Group A and Group B.
Group A, which is the experimental group, was given a heavy, emotionally taxing instruction. They were told to sit in a room for 15 minutes a day for 4 consecutive days and write continuously about their deepest, most traumatic, most profoundly unspoken life experiences.
Things they had never told anyone.
While Group B, the control group, received a completely benign writing prompt. They were instructed to spend the exact same amount of time writing about mundane, superficial topics, like describing the shoes they were currently wearing or the layout of their dorm room.
So to map the terminology, the specific writing prompt given to the student equals the independent variable.
Correct. Now, what was the dependent variable? Pennebaker didn't just ask them how they felt. He went to the University Health Center and tracked exactly how many times each of these 50 students visited a doctor for illness over the next 6 months.
Health center visits equals the dependent variable.
Yes. And the outcome was staggering. The students who were forced to confront and write about their deepest trauma had significantly, demonstrably fewer visits to the doctor for illnesses over the next half year compared to the control group writing about shoes.
The simple physical act of translating unspoken traumatic emotion into narrative language actually caused a measurable improvement in their physical immunological health.
But here is the crucial question for the exam. How do we actually trust those results? To confidently assert that the writing caused the health improvement, an experiment must possess two absolute types of validity.
Internal validity and external validity.
Right. Internal validity is the fortress of the experiment. It means that the researcher is absolutely 100% mathematically sure that their manipulation of the independent variable was the only thing that caused the change in the dependent variable, and that the results weren't hijacked by some sneaky, invisible confound.
And the primary weapons we use to protect internal validity are random assignment and control groups. Let's look at Pennebaker's study again. Imagine if Pennebaker had let the 50 students choose which group they wanted to be in.
Oh, that would be a disaster. Because human nature is a confound.
Exactly. It's highly likely that all the naturally resilient, highly optimistic, psychologically robust students would confidently choose the heavy trauma writing group.
While the students who were already sickly, anxious, and fragile would avoid the trauma and choose to write about their shoes.
Right. And then, 6 months later, when the trauma group has fewer doctor visits, Pennebaker would claim his writing task cured them. But he would be wrong. They were simply healthier people to begin with. Self-selection bias destroyed his internal validity.
This is why random assignment, literally flipping a coin or using a random number generator to place subjects into groups, is the most powerful tool in science.
It levels the playing field.
It theoretically guarantees that all the unseen variables, optimism, immune system strength, baseline anxiety, are distributed equally between both groups before the experiment even starts.
And the control group is equally vital, primarily because of a confound we can never escape: the simple passage of time.
Right, time heals all wounds, theoretically.
If you develop a revolutionary new talk therapy for severe generalized anxiety, and you give it to 10 patients, and 10 weeks later they all feel significantly better, you cannot prove your therapy worked.
Because maybe human beings naturally recover from anxiety spikes after a couple of months, regardless of what you do.
Precisely. You must have a control group that did not receive your therapy, but who also waited the exact same 10 weeks. The control group provides the baseline reality to measure your manipulation against.
But this scientific necessity brings up a massive, profound ethical dilemma, especially when we move into clinical psychopathology. And this is a dilemma we have to grapple with.
You are talking about the morality of the placebo effect and the ethics of withholding treatment.
Yes, the placebo effect is incredibly powerful. We know for a fact that a patient's physical and psychological condition will often significantly improve simply because they expect the treatment to help them, even if a doctor is literally just handing them a useless sugar pill.
The brain heals the body based on belief.
Therefore, to scientifically prove that a brand new experimental antidepressant medication actually works on a biochemical level, you have to use a double-blind, placebo-controlled study.
Meaning neither the patient nor the doctor handing over the pill knows if it's the real drug or a sugar pill.
Right. But think about the profound moral implications of what we are doing in that scenario. You have a human being, a patient, who is suffering from severe, agonizing, potentially life-threatening clinical depression. They come to a research trial desperately begging for help.
And for the sake of internal validity, for the sake of generating a clean statistical data set, the scientist randomly assigns this suffering human being to receive a useless sugar pill.
They look them in the eye, hand them a placebo, and let them suffer in agony for 6 months just to prove a mathematical point on a graph. Is that morally justifiable? Does the abstract interest of scientific progress ever outweigh the immediate, visceral suffering of the individual in front of you?
It is arguably the heaviest ethical question in medical science. And to be frank, in almost any layperson's moral framework, the answer is a resounding no. It is deeply troubling.
Which is why the field of psychology and psychiatry has been forced to radically adapt its ethical standards over the past few decades. You simply cannot leave a suicidal patient untreated.
So what is the compromise? How do we keep the science rigorous without losing our humanity?
There are two main strategies. The first moral compromise is the use of a waitlist control group. Instead of being completely denied help, the patients in the control group are promised that they will receive the real, active, fully funded treatment immediately after the 6-month experimental window concludes.
They are delayed, but they're not abandoned.
And the second strategy is testing against the standard of care. If we are testing a new therapy for depression, and we already possess a therapy that we know works like standard cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, we don't use a sugar pill placebo group anymore. That would be unethical.
Instead, we test the new experimental therapy against the already established CBT. Both groups receive active, helpful treatment.
We just want to see if the new method is statistically better than the gold standard. It's a way of maintaining internal validity without sacrificing the patient's well-being.
Which serves as a perfect, elegant transition to single-subject experimental designs. Because earlier, we definitively stated that case studies looking at one single person cannot prove cause and effect. But, surprisingly, you actually can run a rigorous, valid experiment on a single human being.
The ABA design, also known as the reversal design. I love the logic of this.
Let's explain the phases clearly.
The A phase stands for the baseline. Let's say you have a child who engages in severe headbanging behavior. During phase A, you do nothing. You simply observe and meticulously record the frequency of the problematic behavior as it naturally occurs in their environment.
Then, you introduce phase B, which is the introduction of your psychological treatment. Let's say it's a specific reward system.
Now, if the headbanging drastically decreases during phase B, you might be tempted to celebrate. But as a scientist, you know it could just be a coincidence. Maybe the child just naturally grew out of it that week.
Exactly. So, to prove cause and effect, you have to do something that feels incredibly counterintuitive. You have to execute a reversal. You have to completely remove the reward system and return the child to the baseline conditions of phase A.
Which feels totally mean. You are actively taking away the thing that is helping them.
It is tough, but scientifically necessary. Because if you remove the treatment, return to A, and the headbanging immediately gets worse again, and then you reintroduce the treatment, return to B, and the headbanging immediately stops again, you have effectively eliminated coincidence.
You have definitively proven that your specific treatment is the independent variable controlling the behavior.
My mental shortcut for understanding ABA is imagining testing a mysterious light switch in a brand new house. You walk into a dark room, you observe the darkness, that's your baseline, phase A.
Okay.
You flick the switch up on the wall, the lights instantly come on, that's your treatment, phase B. Did the switch cost the light? Probably. But maybe the power company just happened to fix a neighborhood blackout at that exact millisecond.
A confound.
Right, so to be a scientist, you flick the switch back down, the room goes completely dark, that's your reversal, back to phase A. You flick it up again, the lights blaze back on, phase B. By turning it on, off, and on again, you have successfully proven that the switch controls the light, all within a single subject experiment.
That is a flawless analogy. But once again, the messy reality of human ethics ruins our clean, elegant science. The ABA design works great for minor behavioral modifications. But in serious psychotherapy, the overarching goal of treatment is to produce permanent, enduring cognitive change.
Right. If I spend 6 months teaching a severely depressed client how to fundamentally restructure their negative thought patterns, I can't exactly say to them, okay, great job, you feel better. Now, for the next month, I need you to completely forget all the coping skills I just taught you and go back to being actively suicidal so I can measure the reversal.
It's impossible, and it's deeply unethical.
Exactly. The human mind doesn't have a reset switch. So researchers often use mixed designs or integrative, deeply monitored case studies instead. The textbook provides a fascinating look at Rebecca, a 25-year-old woman suffering from severe bulimia nervosa.
Let's look at Rebecca's case. Her pathology was complex. Her primary trigger was a highly toxic, critical boyfriend who constantly demeaned her weight. In response to his criticism, she would begin severely restricting her food intake.
Which would inevitably lead to binge eating, which she would then follow with vomiting to cope with the shame, eventually escalating to binge drinking. It was a compounding cycle of self-destruction.
So the researchers on her case, Hendricks and Thompson, realized that a standard one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work. They utilized a highly tailored, integrated approach.
They didn't do a reversal design.
They carefully layered two distinct therapies. First, they used cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to aggressively and directly target the restrictive eating habits and the binge drinking behaviors. But CBT alone wasn't enough, because it wasn't addressing the root cause. Her purging was fundamentally triggered by acute interpersonal relationship crises, specifically the boyfriend.
So they brilliantly brought in a second modality, interpersonal therapy, or IPT, to help her build boundaries and manage the toxic relationship dynamics that were causing the anxiety in the first place.
By stage 4 of this integrated, carefully tracked treatment plan, her symptoms were clinically eliminated.
And this naturally brings us to what the textbook defines as a mixed design. This is the zenith of clinical research. This is where you brilliantly combine the broad, classificatory world of correlational research with the rigorous, manipulated world of the experiment.
Explain how you mix them.
In a mixed design, you have two types of independent variables running simultaneously. First, you have an experimental independent variable that you actively manipulate, like randomly assigning patients to receive either CBT or psychoanalysis.
And the second variable, you mix in a classificatory variable that you cannot manipulate, but that you measure like the baseline severity of the patient's illness or their history of childhood trauma.
So why is mixing them so important?
Because it is the only way to avoid the dangerous trap of one-size-fits-all medicine. Let's say you test 3 different therapies on a massive group of 1,000 patients. If you just look at the average, therapy 3 might look like the best overall treatment.
But if you run a mixed design,
And you mathematically split that massive group by their baseline illness severity, a completely different truth emerges. You might discover that therapy 1 is actually vastly superior for people with mild symptoms. Therapy 2 is absolute magic for people with severe symptoms. And therapy 3, which looked like the winner on average, is actually just mediocre for everybody.
it allows for precision. Mixed designs are how we eventually figure out exactly which specific treatment works best for which specific unique subgroup of human beings.
Okay. Take a breath. Look at this whiteboard. We have covered the microscopic focus of case studies. We mapped the broad, tragic landscape of epidemiological trauma. We navigated the directionality traps of correlational data. We survived longitudinal modeling, the ethics of placebo-controlled groups, AB-AB reversal designs, and mixed experimental designs.
I am intellectually exhausted just reading the list back to you. Now imagine you are a practicing clinician. You have a patient sitting in your waiting room. You log onto a university database to figure out how to treat them, and you are confronted with 5,000 different studies on depression.
Some studies say SSRI medications are absolute miracles. Other studies say they are completely useless. Some say CBT is better, others say IPT is better.
The literature is scattered, it is deeply contradictory, and it is overwhelmingly massive. How does any single human being make sense of it all?
They don't. They rely on the ultimate synthesis tool, the meta-analysis.
Meta-analysis. Study of studies.
Invented by Smith, Glass, and Miller in 1980, this was a revolution in psychology. A meta-analysis is a highly complex statistical technique that takes the varying, messy results from hundreds of different independent studies and mathematically converts them into one single, standardized, common metric. This metric is called an effect size.
It's basically translating hundreds of different scientific languages into one universal number so you can actually average them all together.
Exactly. In their groundbreaking 1980 paper, Smith and her colleagues took 475 different contradictory psychotherapy studies involving over 25,000 clients.
Wow.
They mashed them all into a meta-analysis and definitively, statistically proved that clients who received psychotherapy were, on average, better off than 80% of untreated individuals. They mathematically proved that, despite all the noise, therapy actually worked.
And this is where we had to connect this to the bigger picture of our entire study session. People often treat meta-analysis like it is a magical, infallible, purely objective truth machine. They think it's just a computer spitting out God's honest truth.
But it isn't. It is still a human endeavor, which means it is still highly, highly subjective.
Let's illustrate that subjectivity with the biggest fight in modern psychiatry, the antidepressant controversy.
Oh, this is a big one.
The textbook details the incredibly explosive 2005 meta-analysis published by researchers Moncrief and Kirsch. They evaluated all the available data on SSRI antidepressants, drugs like Prozac and Zoloft, which are prescribed to millions of people, and their conclusion was a bombshell.
What did they conclude?
They published that SSRIs possess no clinically meaningful advantage over placebo.
That is a staggering claim. It basically implies that a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry is selling sugar pills. But here's what I don't understand. How can scientists look at the exact same pool of data? Because there were plenty of other meta-analyses published that showed SSRIs do work incredibly well and disagree so violently. Does math lie?
The math doesn't lie. But the humans doing the math make choices. Meta-analysis requires hundreds of micro-decisions. The researchers have to decide which specific studies do we include. Which ones do we throw in the trash because we think the methodology was sloppy?
That inclusion criteria is entirely subjective.
But the Moncrief and Kirsch controversy is even more fascinating because they actually agreed with the previous studies on the raw math. They agreed that there was a statistically significant effect showing that SSRIs outperform placebos.
Wait, I'm confused. They agreed the drugs worked better statistically.
Yes. But they argued that the mathematical difference between the drug and the placebo was so incredibly small that it was merely a trivial statistical difference. They made a clinical judgment call. They decided that the tiny statistical bump simply wasn't practically meaningful enough to change a patient's actual life.
Wow. So it all comes down to interpretation. Because another researcher could look at that exact same tiny mathematical effect size and say, are you kidding me? If I have a patient who is actively suicidal, even a tiny 2% statistical edge over a placebo could be the difference between life and death. That isn't trivial. That is life-saving relief.
Precisely. It comes down to human interpretation. And as a consumer of research, you also have to be incredibly vigilant about moderator variables within a meta-analysis.
A moderator variable, give me an example.
A moderator variable is any hidden factor that influences the outcome of a study in a meaningful way. For example, let's say you are reading a glowing meta-analysis proving that a brand new technique called problem-solving therapy is wildly effective. You have to ask a crucial question.
What's the question?
Who conducted the original studies? The textbook points out a massive, embarrassing reality in our field. Therapy looks highly, almost unbelievably effective, primarily when the developer of the therapy is the one running the study.
That is shocking. So the guy who invented the therapy and whose entire career and ego relies on it working somehow magically gets the absolute best statistical results in his lab.
Exactly. It's called the Legion's bias. And if the person conducting the meta-analysis doesn't mathematically account for that specific moderator variable, their final objective conclusion is going to be wildly skewed by the original researcher's egos.
Okay, I am officially closing the textbook. We did it. We have systematically mapped out every single corner of Chapter 4.
We've covered the entire spectrum of psychological epistemology. We started with the raw, messy, deeply subjective humanity of single case studies. We zoomed out to look at the broad, often tragic societal landscape of epidemiological data.
We navigated the treacherous logical traps of correlations, and we finally landed on the rigorous yet morally complex proving grounds of the true experiment and the meta-analysis.
To our third study buddy listening in right now, thank you for hanging with us through all of this density. I really hope the flowchart analogies, the football field metaphors, and the light switch concepts help you ace your own exam.
Me too.
But honestly, way more importantly than the exam, I hope this deep dive reminded you of the core truth of our field. Behind every single p-value, behind every correlation coefficient, and behind every abstract effect size we just debated, there is real, breathing human being who is suffering and who is desperately trying to get better.
And that leads me to a final, somewhat provocative thought I want to leave you with, something to really chew on before you sit down to rate this test.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this entire session outlining the scientific method, the desperate, rigorous push for absolute, undeniable objectivity. We demand strict testability. We demand replicable sets of operations. We design double-blind placebos to strip away bias. But given what we just learned about the reality of meta-analyses, given that brilliant researchers can look at the exact same data on antidepressants and violently disagree based on their own subjective clinical judgment, and given that psychotherapy is, at its absolute core, a deeply intimate interpersonal relationship between two flawed, biased human beings, is a truly 100% objective science of human suffering actually possible?
Well, that is the question, isn't it?
Or is the very act of trying to heal a human mind inherently, unavoidably, and beautifully subjective? Think about that for your next exam.
Good luck studying, everyone. See you next time.